Morning mist drifted over the village green as Eleanor Fletcher stepped from her cottage, clutching the basket that carried today's fragile lacework. She walked with practiced composure, though the echo of last night's sleepless hours still shadowed her eyes. The air smelled of damp earth and distant chimney smoke, a reminder that even the simplest day demanded unyielding endurance. Eleanor hoped to reach the market before gossip sharpened its claws, yet she sensed already the familiar prickle of curiosity following her quiet steps, with each measured stride carrying the weight of unspoken worries she dared not name aloud that morning. The market square awakened with the creak of carts and the rustle of burlap sacks, but its warmth dimmed when Mrs. Hargrave's sharp voice sliced through the air. The magistrate's wife stood flanked by her companions, their shawls drawn primly as if virtue itself clung to their hems. Eleanor offered a polite nod, hoping to pass unnoticed, but Mrs. Hargrave stepped forward with a smile too brittle to disguise her intent. She remarked on Eleanor's unmarried state, her modest earnings, and the unfortunate brevity of her prospects, ensuring every bystander heard each carefully barbed word she released into the morning. Eleanor kept her gaze steady, though heat pooled in her cheeks, and her throat tightened with the effort of preserving dignity before the gathering crowd. She knew that any sign of wounded pride would feed the village's appetite for spectacle, so she inhaled steadily and thanked Mrs. Hargrave for her concern. The woman's eyes gleamed with triumph, for nothing pleased her more than reminding others of their inferior placement upon society's ladder. Eleanor paid for her stall space, set down her basket, and arranged her lace with careful hands, though the delicate patterns blurred behind the weight of humiliation today. By midday the market's clamor pressed against Eleanor's senses. Each exchanged coin and murmured greeting, reminding her of her precarious place among neighbors who measured worth by lineage rather than kindness. She sold a few pieces to visiting travelers who admired her craftsmanship without probing into her personal affairs, a small mercy that steadied her resolve. Yet whispers followed her from stall to stall, carried by women eager for diversion and men who found amusement in her discomfort. When the church bell tolled, she gathered her remaining lace and prepared to leave, longing for the quiet refuge of the path. The narrow lane leading from the square opened into a shaded corridor of oaks, whose branches arched above her like a vault of muted green. Here, at last, the constant murmur of judgment softened into the rustle of leaves and the distant call of a woodlark. Eleanor breathed deeply, allowing the hush to soothe the sting of Mrs. Hargrave's cruelty and the villagers' careless amusement. Though she tried to focus on the steady rhythm of her steps, an uneasy feeling crept along her spine, as though the woods whispered of something waiting just beyond the next bend in the road. When she rounded the curve, the world shifted with startling abruptness. A scatter of broken branches littered the path, and deep impressions marked the damp soil where hooves had churned the earth in violent haste. Eleanor halted, gripping her basket as her pulse quickened. A glint of metal caught her eye, a discarded pistol lying half hidden beneath a spray of bracken. She hesitated, torn between curiosity and caution, yet a faint cry, thin, wavering, unmistakably human, rose from the shadows, drawing her forward despite every instinct urging retreat toward the source with a courage that surprised her in its sudden fierceness. The trees thinned, revealing a figure collapsed beside the hedgerow, his dark coat torn and one arm twisted at an unnatural angle. Beside him lay two infants wrapped in travel-worn blankets, their small bodies trembling with cold and fear. Eleanor dropped to her knees, momentarily frozen by the enormity of the scene. The man's face was ashen, his breath shallow, yet his hand rested protectively across the nearest child. Another weak cry escaped the second infant, snapping Eleanor from her shock as she reached forward with trembling hands seeking to offer warmth before their fragile strength faded into chilling silence. The man stirred at her touch, eyelids fluttering as though dragged from the depths of an exhausted dream. His voice emerged in a hoarse whisper, scarcely louder than the rustling leaves. He muttered words she struggled to discern, fragments of warning threaded with desperation, and his fingers tightened weakly around the child he sheltered. Eleanor leaned closer, urging him to remain still, yet his gaze sought hers with startling urgency. For a moment, she sensed the gravity of something far larger than an accident upon a country road, echoes of danger lingering in every shallow breath he managed to draw. He tried to lift his head, but the effort stole what little strength remained. His mouth shaped a single plea, fractured by pain and fading consciousness. Eleanor bent still nearer, her ear almost to his lips, catching only the faintest thread of sound. The words were unclear, yet their urgency chilled her. Protect them. She looked at the infants, their wide eyes glistening, and felt a surge of resolve that overpowered her trembling fear. Whatever misfortune had brought this broken man to her path, She could not abandon him or the children he fought to shield that bleak afternoon. Alone. As the wind stirred through the canopy above, Eleanor gathered her courage and slipped her arms beneath the nearer infant, cradling the child against her shawl while steadying the man with her other hand. His eyes drifted shut, yet his expression eased as though trusting her with his final breath. Eleanor glanced toward the distant village, imagining every whisper that would follow if she returned carrying an unconscious stranger and two unknown babes. Still, she refused to let fear decide the moment. With careful breaths, she prepared to lift them all and change the course of her quiet life forever. Eleanor's cottage, humble and time-worn, seemed to shrink beneath the weight of the man she carried inside. She eased him onto her narrow bed, then gathered the infants, placing them in a wicker cradle lined with her softest linens. The small room filled quickly with the sense of damp wool, cooling hearth smoke, and the sharp tang of blood that clung to the stranger's torn coat. Though her heart stuttered with fear, her hands moved with steady purpose, for the baby's cries pierced the air with a helpless urgency that banished hesitation. She warmed milk over the fire, whispering gentle assurances to beings too young to understand words yet deeply responsive to tenderness. When she returned to the man's side, she noticed details she had been too frantic to absorb in the woods. The fine stitching of his waistcoat, the craftsmanship of his boots, the subtle crest engraved on his signet ring. None of it aligned with a common traveler. She brushed a curl of dark hair from his forehead and found a wound splitting the skin along his temple. Cleaning it revealed a face striking in its structure, refined, resolute even in unconsciousness. Whoever he was, he lived a life far removed from hers. Still, she refused to let that dictate the care she owed another human soul. A soft knock startled her. The village doctor, summoned by a passing neighbor, entered without waiting for invitation, his brows lifting as he surveyed the scene. His gaze lingered too long on the bed where the man lay, then flitted to the infants nestled in Eleanor's cradle. He asked terse questions, where she found them, why she brought them here, whether anyone else had seen. His tone, though polite, carried a shadow of suspicion that prickled her composure. She answered truthfully, yet her voice trembled when he speculated that the stranger might be an outlaw fleeing justice. He examined the wound with swift competence, declared it severe but survivable, and left with a backward glance that suggested her explanation would soon travel farther than she wished. When his footsteps faded, tension seeped into the dim corners of the cottage. Eleanor sat beside the stranger, dabbing his brow with a damp cloth. The infants slept now, their tiny breaths soft and steady. She wondered who their mother was, whether she would come searching, or whether she, too, had been lost to whatever calamity had driven this man to collapse along the forest road. Eleanor whispered a prayer, not knowing what fate she had entangled herself in or how swiftly the village would distort her act of compassion into something sullied. She stepped outside briefly to fetch more water from the well, only to find a cluster of women gathered nearby, their murmurs swirling like wind-blown leaves. They fell silent when she approached. Mrs. Hargrave stood at the center, her posture rigid with self-satisfaction. She asked pointedly if Eleanor had taken in a guest, emphasizing the word with a mocking lilt. Eleanor's polite refusal to explain only deepened their curiosity. She returned to her cottage with her pulse racing, aware that the first threads of scandal had begun to weave themselves around her name before she had even drawn breath to defend it. Inside, the man stirred. His eyelids fluttered, then opened slowly, revealing eyes as storm-colored as a gathering squall. For a moment, confusion clouded his features, but when he glimpsed the cradle, panic jolted through him. He tried to rise, grimacing as pain clamped around his ribs. Eleanor hurried to steady him, assuring him the children were safe, the cottage secure. He studied her face with wary intensity, as though measuring whether she posed any threat. His voice, when it emerged, was hoarse but unmistakably shaped by privilege and education. He asked where he was, how long he had been unconscious, whether anyone else had seen him. Eleanor explained what she could, then waited, expecting gratitude. Instead, the man closed his eyes, jaw tightening as though battling the weight of some unseen calamity. He eventually opened them again and, with evident reluctance, murmured his name, Richard Hawthorne. The title he followed with, Duke of Greycourt, hung in the air like a tolling bell, altering the very shape of the room. Eleanor stepped back, stunned. She had heard the name often, always spoken with a mixture of respect and curiosity, yet she had never imagined the aloof nobleman would lie wounded upon her bed. Richard noticed her shock and softened slightly, though caution remained etched into every line of his posture. He asked for the children, pulling the cradle closer. His hands trembled as he touched each sleeping cheek. The tenderness of the gesture contradicted every rumor she had heard about him. Rumors of coldness, remoteness, a duke uninterested in the world beyond his estate walls. When she asked if the infants were his, he gave a quiet, pained denial, explaining only that they were under his protection, though he withheld the greater truth. His reluctance was not one of distrust, she realized, but of fearing what might happen if too many knew. When a sudden knock sounded at her door, Richard stiffened. Eleanor peeked outside to find the vicar, who had come to offer moral guidance, though his eyes darted past her shoulder in search of the rumored stranger. She spoke firmly, refusing him entrance, and closed the door despite his disapproving huff. Richard exhaled sharply, gratitude flickering across his features. He reached for her hand, lightly, uncertainly, then released it as if startled by the impulse. He asked why she bothered to defend him when she had no obligation to do so. Eleanor replied simply that no one deserved to be hunted while wounded, and the children deserved safety above all. Her words struck him with visible force. After a hesitant pause, Richard reached beneath his coat and retrieved a small ivory token carved with an intricate hawthorn blossom. He placed it in her palm, explaining that it belonged to his late sister and bore a symbol recognized by all connected to Greycourt. He told her to keep it, to show it if anyone questioned her honor or her reasons for sheltering him. His voice wavered slightly, betraying a vulnerability he worked hard to conceal. The infants stirred, their soft whimpers weaving through the quiet. Richard leaned back, exhausted, yet his gaze remained fixed on Eleanor as though anchoring himself with the sight of her. She tucked the token safely into a drawer, promising to guard it, and him, with equal discretion. Though they spoke no further, a fragile understanding settled between them, born of necessity yet rooted in something deeper. Trust formed under duress and strengthened by courage neither had expected to find. Outside, wheels rumbled along the distant road. Eleanor lifted the curtain just enough to see a grand carriage bearing the unmistakable colors of Greycourt approaching the village. Her breath caught and she whispered Richard's name. He opened his eyes, dread darkening them as the sounds grew louder. Whatever misfortune had befallen him was closer than either wished, and Eleanor felt her world teeter on the edge of a precipice she had never imagined stepping toward. A pale hush settled over the cottage as the wheels of the Greycourt carriage faded down the distant lane, leaving only the crackle of the hearth to steady Eleanor's breathing. Richard remained motionless upon the bed, listening with the sharpened tension of a man accustomed to lurking danger. When at last he deemed the sound far enough away, he exhaled slowly, as though releasing a weight too long held against his ribs. Eleanor watched him, unsure whether to speak or keep the fragile quiet intact. His pallor still alarmed her, yet his eyes held a new alertness, as though the nearness of discovery had awakened something fierce and unyielding in him. He asked whether anyone had approached the cottage while he slept, and Eleanor recounted the vicar's attempted visit. Richard grimaced, not from pain alone but from an awareness of how rapidly scandal could spread through a village that thrived on speculation. He asked about the doctor, whether his demeanor had betrayed curiosity or suspicion. Eleanor described the doctor's lingering glances, and Richard muttered that a whisper could travel from one end of the county to the other in a matter of hours. She reminded him that fear would do nothing for the children who now slept peacefully, unaware of the storm looming over their small lives. The infants stirred, and Richard struggled to sit upright, wincing as sharp pain seized his side. Eleanor rushed to steady him, sliding a cushion behind his back. He murmured thanks, though the softness of his tone startled him as much as it did her. His hand brushed hers, not with intention but with necessity, yet the brief contact lingered between them like the ember of a thought neither dared speak. He glanced away quickly as though chastising himself for any indulgence in vulnerability. Night fell swiftly, weaving shadows across the walls. Eleanor lit a single candle, then sat at her small table to mend the tear in his coat. Her needle glinted with each measured stitch, and Richard watched her work with an intensity that bordered on discomfort, for himself, not for her. She possessed a quiet diligence he had rarely witnessed among the daughters of noble houses, whose accomplishments were often performed with theatrical flourish rather than sincere purpose. Eleanor's movements were unpretentious, yet imbued with a steadiness that unnerved him in its gentleness. He asked what compelled her to bring a wounded stranger and 2 infants into her home when she had no assurance the act would not ruin her. Eleanor hesitated, then answered with a simplicity that struck him deeper than elaborate gratitude ever could. She acted because the children were vulnerable, and because compassion cost her nothing compared to what abandonment might have cost them. Her humility unraveled the defenses he had spent years constructing, brick by brick, against the world's expectations. When she finished mending the coat, she returned to the bedside. The candle threw warm light over his features, revealing exhaustion that mingled with a grim determination to remain alert. She asked whether the carriage belonged to him. He nodded, then admitted it likely carried those loyal not to him but to Benedict Hawthorne, his cousin. At the mention of the name, his voice tightened as though shaped by old bitterness. Eleanor sensed that whatever had driven him to the forest path extended far beyond bandits or misfortune. Her silence invited explanation. Richard turned his gaze to the cradle, watching the infants sleep in soft synchrony. He confessed that they were the children of his late sister, whose reputation had been threatened by a liaison that would have shattered her standing. After her death, he vowed to protect the infants from becoming pawns in Greycourt's political machinations, yet Benedict saw in them an opportunity, a way to claim the dukedom by painting Richard unfit to oversee his estate with scandal shadowing his household. Richard had been transporting the children to a safer location when he was ambushed, and he suspected the attack had been arranged by his cousin, though proving it would be as difficult as moving the stars from their courses. Eleanor absorbed the revelation with widening sorrow. She recognized the complexity of his burden, grief, duty, and danger woven into a single thread he must protect at all costs. Richard, seeing her compassion, felt compelled to continue. He confessed that the dukedom had never been a crown he sought but a mantle inherited through obligation. Greycourt demanded constant vigilance, endless negotiation, and an iron composure he had maintained so long he scarcely remembered how to be anything else. Yet here, in a cottage far removed from ballrooms and parliamentary debates, he found himself uncharacteristically undone. A sudden knock jolted them both. Richard's hand flew protectively to the cradle, while Eleanor froze, her breath lodged in her throat. The knock came again, firmer this time. Eleanor opened the door only a fraction, revealing a villager known for his appetite for gossip. He inquired about the rumor of a man in her home, pushing against the door as though entitled to entry. Eleanor held firm, insisting she was unwell and could not receive visitors. Her refusal sharpened the man's suspicion, and he tried once more to peer inside before finally leaving with a vow to return. When she closed the door, her hands trembled. Richard rose despite his injury, bracing himself against the bed frame. He apologized for bringing danger to her doorstep, though Eleanor reminded him that she had chosen this course. Her words quieted him, yet guilt lingered in his eyes. She guided him back to the bed, and for a moment, their faces hovered mere inches apart. The proximity stole their breath, though neither moved away. Richard murmured that he owed her more than words could hold, and Eleanor simply whispered that safety mattered more than reputation, at least for this night. A crack of thunder shook the roof, followed by rain that drummed steadily against the windows. The storm deepened the intimacy of the small cottage, drawing them into a cocoon of shared concern. As lightning lit the room, Richard's expression softened with an emotion too fragile to name. He admitted he feared what would become of the children if he failed them, and Eleanor laid a hand over his, assuring him he had not failed, not while he could still fight. The infants stirred again and Eleanor lifted them gently, rocking them until they quieted. Richard watched her with a gaze that blended awe and gratitude. He confessed, haltingly, that he had seldom encountered someone who acted purely out of kindness without seeking advantage. Eleanor flushed, uncertain how to respond to a duke who spoke with such earnest vulnerability. When the storm finally softened to a distant murmur, Richard leaned back, exhaustion claiming him. Eleanor tucked a blanket around the cradle, then sat beside him. He whispered that he feared sleep, worried that waking might bring ruin. She replied that morning would bring its own trials, but tonight they were safe. Her words, tender yet resolute, carried him into slumber. Eleanor watched him breathe, understanding that whatever tomorrow held, the fragile trust between them had deepened into something neither fully grasped yet both instinctively protected. The storm eased outside, but within the cottage another storm, quieter, far more dangerous, had begun to gather. Autumn's first frost clung to the gardens of Greycourt Manor on the night of the harvest ball, turning every hedge and statue into a sculpture of pale silver. Eleanor arrived in a borrowed carriage arranged discreetly by one of Richard's trusted servants, though she suspected the gesture came from the Duke himself. As she stepped onto the gravel drive, her breath caught at the manor's grandeur, a towering facade of pale stone illuminated by rows of lanterns whose warm glow softened the severity of its architecture. She clutched the invitation Richard had sent days earlier, a simple card embossed with the hawthorn crest, though its meaning weighed far heavier than its paper. Villagers and gentry alike streamed through the entrance, their whispers rising like a restless tide when they noticed her presence. Inside, the ballroom shimmered with candlelight. Crystal chandeliers refracted light across marble floors, creating a constellation of glimmers beneath the dancers' feet. Eleanor stood near the threshold, unsure where to go, her modest blue gown a stark contrast to the elaborate silks swirling around her. She inhaled nervously, unable to ignore the pointed glances cast her way. Mrs. Hargrave, resplendent in burgundy satin, eyed her with unmistakable disdain, whispering behind a gloved hand to those eager for scandal. Yet before unease could overtake her, Richard appeared at the far end of the ballroom, moving with a steadiness that commanded attention without demanding it. His gaze found hers instantly, and something unspoken passed between them: recognition, gratitude, and something more fragile, trembling at the edge of confession. He crossed the ballroom with deliberate grace, ignoring the murmurs that rippled behind him. When he reached Eleanor, he bowed with a sincerity that startled the onlookers into silence. He offered his arm without hesitation, requesting the honor of her company. She placed her hand upon his sleeve, feeling the firm strength beneath the fabric, and allowed him to guide her toward the center of the floor. The orchestra began a gentle waltz, and Richard led her into the dance with practiced ease, though his movements softened for her benefit. As they turned beneath the chandeliers, Eleanor felt the tension in her shoulders ease, replaced by a warmth that stirred beneath her ribs. She dared not voice the feeling, yet she sensed Richard perceived it all the same. When the final note faded, Richard guided her onto a quieter terrace where moonlit air drifted through the colonnade. The gardens beyond lay washed in silver, the frost shimmering like scattered starlight. Richard released her arm reluctantly, as though afraid that distance might sever the fragile connection forming between them. He confessed that he had spent the past weeks restoring order at Greycourt, uncovering Benedict's schemes, reclaiming loyalty from wavering allies, and securing the twins' rightful place within the family. His voice deepened when he spoke of his cousin's treachery, yet softened when he described the children now thriving under proper care. Eleanor listened with careful attention, recognizing the quiet exhaustion beneath his composure. Duty had shaped him, perhaps even hardened him, yet tonight he appeared markedly changed, less guarded, more human. Richard turned to her fully, his expression solemn yet luminous with resolve. He told her that he had replayed their days in the cottage countless times, wondering how fate had led him into the arms of someone whose compassion he had not earned. He admitted he had feared the scandal surrounding her, for he knew the village had treated her unjustly. His fingers brushed the railing before he straightened, gathering the strength to speak the words that pressed against his heart. He confessed that in her presence, he felt seen not as a title or a burdened heir but as a man capable of choosing his own destiny. Her courage, he said, had taught him that gentleness could be a form of strength he had long misunderstood. Eleanor tried to protest, insisting that she had done only what conscience demanded, but Richard shook his head gently. He told her that courage born of compassion was rarer than any inheritance he possessed. She felt a tremor run through her as he stepped closer, though propriety restrained his touch. His voice dropped to a near whisper, trembling in its sincerity, as he asked whether she might consider remaining at Greycourt not as a caretaker, nor as a subject of gratitude, but as an equal partner in a life shaped by mutual respect and quiet devotion. The question hung between them like breath on cold air, fragile yet radiant. Before Eleanor could reply, the doors behind them opened, and the murmur of guests spilled onto the terrace. Among them came a group of villagers, drawn by the Duke's conspicuous absence from the ballroom. Mrs. Hargrave pushed to the front, eager to reclaim the narrative she believed rightfully hers. She accused Eleanor of manipulating the Duke, insisting that a woman of such low standing could not possibly deserve the attention he lavished upon her. Richard stepped forward instantly, his tone sharp enough to still the night. He declared before nobles and villagers alike that Eleanor Fletcher had saved his life and safeguarded the future of Greycourt itself. He proclaimed the twins as his sister's children, cherished and protected, and named Eleanor their devoted guardian. The crowd stood stunned as Richard lifted Eleanor's hand with quiet reverence. He announced their engagement in a steady voice, not as spectacle but as truth long overdue. Gasps rippled across the terrace, yet no dissent dared rise against the unwavering conviction in his expression. Eleanor's heart fluttered painfully, overwhelmed by the enormity of the moment. She saw in Richard not a duke claiming a prize but a man choosing a life shaped by gratitude, admiration, and burgeoning affection. The tension of weeks dissolved as he asked her softly, away from prying ears, whether she consented to share that life with him. Her yes emerged not as a dramatic declaration but as a gentle certainty, woven from every moment they had weathered together. The orchestra resumed inside, and Richard guided her back into the ballroom, where the guests parted with awed silence. The twins, brought forward by a trusted maid, reached eagerly for Eleanor, sealing a future none of them could have predicted. As Richard wrapped his hand around hers, the narrator of their tale might have said that Greycourt had gained not merely a duchess but a new beginning shaped by quiet courage and steadfast love.